just to do this? Well, here's an appropriate question, and this comes to us from member Troy Stevens, and he asks, this is, say, particularly appropriate to what we just started with here. He asks, what technologies are necessary for off-world survival? Let me try that again. What technologies necessary for off-world survival have been most neglected or underestimated in our efforts so far? If freedom's future lies on new frontiers, American space, what do we most need to be working on now, technically and otherwise, to make this migration into those frontiers possible? Great question, Troy. I have a profound confidence that that these are not questions that they routinely get on the Young Turks show, by way of example. And as it turns out, it's a great question, and I happen to have handy two answers. And these answers came to me from the years of work I did on, again, Aurora, just like that name, the movie Aurora, which was about a mission to Jupiter in the present day with no magic, no warp drives, no nothing, just had to get there. So to answer your question, there are two technologies that we need to be working on real hard. The first one is nuclear rockets. Here's the problem. It takes energy to go to Mars, and right now, the only way we can move through space is through rockets. It's be nice to have a reactionless drive where we're warping space or doing anything. But right now, basically, what we have to do is we have to shove something out of the end of the spacecraft, and the Newton's second law, I think it is, equal and opposite reaction. Something gets pushed out the back, and its explosion is pushing against the pressure chamber of the rocket motor. And since gas can escape out one end, it doesn't the other end, and that pushes the rocket through space. So far, so good. Now, the problem is that you need a fair amount of thrust. We're going to assume that we're launching from Earth orbit, so let's not worry about getting the thing up there. Because if you're third law, thank you. If you're going to go to Mars or something, 97% of your work is getting from the surface of the Earth to Earth orbit. So here's the problem. Fantastic. We burn a rocket and we go to Mars. Great. Let me rephrase this. This is a tricky issue. The more thrust that we apply over time, more delta, the faster the trip is. So if we burn a rocket engine for 2 minutes, it gets a certain speed. And if we burn that same engine for 10 minutes, it gets us to a significantly faster speed, and so on and so on and so on. But the problem is this. If you're going to have a rocket firing, you need to carry rocket fuel. And then you need fuel to move that fuel. And then if you're going to turn around and stop on the other end, which may be weeks or months ahead of you, you have to push enough fuel to Mars so that when you get to Mars, you have enough fuel to stop and turn around. And it's a very, very dicey thing. And so miles per gallon becomes a very, very important issue. Now, I'm using miles per gallon specifically as a half a joke, but essentially it's very nearly that. The term is called specific impulse, and miles per gallon is not a bad way to think of it. A specific impulse is a measure of how much thrust you can get out of a pound of fuel, basically. And the higher that number is, the better off you are. To give you, and these numbers are coming from memory, but they're not too far off. To give you, so it's a measure of the engine's efficiency, not just its total thrust, because you have big engines that give you a whole lot of thrust, but they're not very efficient. So the main engines on the Saturn V first stage had a specific impulse, I want to say about 250. The shuttle main engines were considerably better. They were 400, 420, 450, something like that. But nuclear engine starts probably around 800, 900. So it's automatically twice as efficient, which means that you can go twice as fast on the same fuel. That may not be actually true, but you get twice the thrust. You get the idea. Now, what's particularly interesting about this is back in 1966, I want to say, '67 was one of those years, right around the time Star Trek hit TV. The Defense Department funded something called Project Nerva, and it was the idea of building a nuclear rocket, and they built it this facility out at Jackass Flats, Nevada. It turns out that Project Nerva had something like 20 different engines built, different sizes, different configurations, and they all work like a charm. And the reason that the nuclear rocket does so much better is very simple. A rocket goes through space by having fuel expand into gas, and the more energetic that expansion is, the more thrust is available. So if you take your fuel and you get a little push, that's not going to help you a lot. If you can get your fuel to give you enormous expansion, same amount of fuel, you get much better delta V. So the reason that nuclear rockets have to take over is because the space shuttle main engines and whatever X-Core is using, whatever SpaceX is using now, whatever it is, it's going to be pretty close to 400 because that's about the limit of chemistry. Chemistry cannot get any hotter than that, or at least hot that fast. We're pretty much against the limits of it. We're taking the most volatile fuel we have, and we're throwing as much oxygen in there in form of liquid oxygen as it'll take. And so we are getting a chemical explosion of the highest magnitude possible, and it's not enough. So we get these chemicals, throw them together in the combustion chamber. When they meet each other, they react, and they basically expand rapidly, and that provides thrust. But you can only go so far with chemical rockets. When they started doing the Nerva project, they were getting 800 to 900 right out of the gate. And that's because the Nerva rocket, maybe the solid core nuclear rocket, is maybe the simplest device ever. I mean, there's just nothing to it. It is a hunk of uranium with holes drilled through it. And what happens is you pass liquid hydrogen, let's say, into this cylinder honeycombed with holes. And since it's uranium and it's at critical mass, it's very, 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 very hot. And so if you pump liquid hydrogen, let's say, it doesn't have to be that, it can be methane, can be water probably. The heat of the nuclear reaction is so great that it causes the gas to expand at a rate higher than any chemical reaction is possible. That's a solid core nuclear rocket, and we built 20 of them, and they work like a charm because there's nothing to them. Now, they do leave a radioactive wake. It's not a problem in space. Space is filled with radiation. The only reason we're here is because we've got this tremendous atmospheric shield and magnetic shield from the Earth that's protecting us. So putting some nuclear radiation into space is not going to hurt anybody. Now, the problem is, if your whole goal is to make something hot and then passing a fuel through it so that it expands as much as possible, the hotter it is, the more expansion you get per pound of fuel, the more efficient your rocket engine is, and the faster you can go by carrying a set amount of fuel. We talked about this last week or a couple weeks ago. You can keep adding fuel, but it just gets worse and worse and worse. In other words, we're going to use an even powerful rocket, which means we need more fuel, which means we need more fuel to stop, which means we need an even bigger rocket, and so on. So it's all about efficiency. So that's a solid core nuclear rocket. It gets to about 800 800 seconds of specific impulse. Again, 250 for the Saturn V main engines and 450 maybe for the shuttle main engines. So they're twice as efficient. And somewhere around 1,000 seconds of specific impulse, you run into a problem, and the problem is that any hotter than that, and the uranium melts. It melts the container, and so you can only get to 800, 900, 1,200, somewhere in that ballpark, by using high temperature ceramics and stuff. But you can't get much more of an energetic reaction than that, because you can't make things any hotter than that, because if you do, they melt. Aha! But magnetic fields don't melt. And so the next step is something called a gas core nuclear rocket. And in a gas core nuclear rocket, you have You have a uranium gas, and it's a plasma. It's kept together by magnetic fields, so it's never actually touching the walls of the rocket engine. And because it's contained by a magnetic field, you can get that thing very, very, very hot, much hotter. And when you start into getting things like gas cores or pebble beds and stuff, now you're talking about being able to get to 2,000, 3,000, and then space travel becomes feasible. Because the problem with everything on the board right now is time, right? Our rocket engines are so inefficient that it takes months. Any plan I've seen for a Mars mission is going to require something like 5 months of coasting, because that is the best that we can do with chemical rockets. It's just a physics limitation. We cannot get chemical rockets to be much more efficient than they are now. We're almost exactly there. It's like jet engines and so on. We're pretty much at peak efficiency. And you can't carry enough fuel to go burn longer than that, because then all your fuel things become an issue. So basically, you're looking at 3 to 5 months going to Mars. And this is where the problem comes in. For example, if you had enough thrust and you could get to Mars in 6 hours, who cares how big the ship is? Who cares about artificial gravity? Who cares about food supplies? If you could get there in 6 hours, it's basically the time it took you to fly from Los Angeles to New York. You have a whole different set of non-problems. And if something goes wrong and you can get help there in 6 hours instead of 6 months, even better. And if you can come back in 6 minutes, or 6 hours rather, that's good too. So it's all about reducing the travel time. And that's Mars. Mars is interesting. Venus is closer. You can travel less, probably get to Venus and back in 3 months, I would say 2 to 3 months. You can't land there though. But the problem is that that's just to Mars, 6 months to Mars. And then all the stuff that's interesting is much further away than Mars. And the further out you go, it becomes exponentially farther. So what you need is you want a big, nasty, hard push, and you want it to go as long as possible. And in the perfect situation is you are thrusting at full thrust, and then halfway at the destination you have to turn around, because now you've got to spend the second half of the trip slowing down. That's the theoretical fastest you can get there. But I remember the Voyager, Pioneer probes and Voyager taking 7 years, something like that, to get to Jupiter. And then New Horizons, which was heading to Pluto, which didn't have to stop, didn't have to carry enough fuel. It got to Jupiter in 2-3 months. Took 3.5 days to get to the moon. New Horizons did it in like 9 hours, because it didn't have to stop. And if you're going to go to Pluto, you got to go fast, otherwise there's no point. So anyway, so rocket technology, nuclear rockets are it, and the problem is not, hey, how do you build one of these? We built them in the 60s, and they work just fine. And you can go and see the abandoned facility in Jackass Flats, Nevada, where back 50 years ago, we were still a country with some, guts and some willpower. The problem with getting this rocket engine is got nothing to do with technology. It's all political will. They're never they would launch something like Cassini or Galileo, which are not powered by a nuclear rocket, but they do have a small little RTG radiothermal generator. Got a little piece of radioactive material that heats up stuff, and that powers the thing, because there's not enough sunlight out there for solar panels. And I remember when they launched Galileo. I certainly remember when they launched Cassini. The shrieking lunatics on the left were calling it the Cassini warhead, because if the thing were to explode on takeoff, the planet would be poisoned forever by a hunk of whatever it was the size of our fist. So it's a political issue. It's just that simple. And when you think about what they're doing with trying to shut down nuclear power, commercial power, it's enough to make you cry. And if it weren't for the Navy, frankly, it would be pretty much game over. But our subs, all of our subs, with the exception of like the research sub or the rescue subs, but all of our regular duty subs are nuclear powered, have been for 60 years or longer. I think the first one, I think Nautilus was 57 or 59. It was pretty much as old as I am, so it's 60 years ago now. And we've been sending young men, and now young men and are women on subs? I'm not sure. I don't think they are. We've been sending young men around the world underwater in a steel tube right next to nuclear reactors for 60 years, and we've had 30, 40, 50 of them at sea at the same time. We've never had a problem. I have had the experience of sitting in a booth in a what felt like an American Legion hall, with wood paneling everywhere, and just like being on ground, rock solid, except I was 600 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific, and I was moving at 20 knots. And behind me, because I knew enough about the sub layout, I want to say about, I don't know, 7, 8 yards, maybe less, more like 10 feet, 12 feet, something like that. Behind me were two nuclear reactors, I think it's two, capable of generating 160 million watts, 160 megawatts. Okay, so no women on subs, yeah. 160 million watts of power sitting just behind me, 10 feet away, and one reactor. Thank you. It's always nice to be around with people who know what they're doing. So the surface ships have the Nimitz class has multiple reactors. I think it might have 4. Anyway, one on a sub, but still 160 million watts of power is enough to really, well, to drive this big hunk of steel around the world endlessly for 25 or 30 years. It doesn't ever have to come up for air. It makes its own air. It has to. Its limitation is the crew. Its limitation is food and crew endurance. But basically, you could drive that thing around the world at the equator for 25 years and never surface. Yeah, Enterprise was the first reactor. It had eight reactors. I did not know that, Dave Big Booty. So it can be done, and it is done. It's done on a daily basis. So I'm going to get to some other questions. So I said there were 2 technologies. That's one of them. The other technology I had to deal with in my Aurora screenplay was, since we're talking about a trip to Jupiter, we're really looking at being out there for 9 months at least. They had a nuclear rocket engine, which helped them get there. But they had to go 9 months, and we're going to have to go 6 to Mars. And I did a lot of research into this. So the other thing that we need some kind of hibernation. Now, the stasis field has been with science fiction forever, but it's not only possible. I mean, it's just done on a daily basis. So I did a lot of research into this. And I found a couple of things that were interesting. One of them is, if you feed animals, including humans, dogs, mammals, basically, if you feed them a mixture of normal air, but you add quite a bit of sulfur, I think it's sulfur dioxide. I'm pretty sure it's sulfur dioxide. The metabolism goes way down. Goes down to, 6 heartbeats a minute, and your body temperature goes from 98.6 down to 68 or 70 or something. And that is an incredible, unbelievable difference. And that's just by adding this sulfur dioxide. I think it's sulfur dioxide. Anyway, the point is, what you're really going to need to be able to do is to have a way to reliably get people to sleep through most of the mission, not just because of boredom and all the rest of that stuff, but to keep supplies manageable and so on. And basically, you would have you'd have an anesthesiologist. I'm sure it'd be all monitored by computers, but essentially, you lie down, and it's not going to be this kind of nice thing where you sit there and this little plexiglass thing comes down. I think you're basically going to get there, and first of all, you're going to get hooked up to tubes. And the way I had it written was, they put a catheter in your wrist, and then they give you an injection of happy stuff, and you become unconscious as you would in any other form of general anesthesia. Once you're unconscious, they have to put a feeding tube down your throat, because you've got to be fed during the 4 to 6 weeks that I had you down there, being rotating on and off, about 4 to 6 weeks. So you got to get a feeding tube down there, and you have to get other tubes other places as well, because what goes in comes out generally, and all of this is nasty and not clean, and in the sense of like the science fiction kind of. I think I'll lie down and sleep now, but it's cool, and with that technology. Well, if you had that technology really well established and safe, then suddenly your poor engine efficiency is not nearly as big of a problem. But those two things would get us the solar system. Either one of them would go a long way, but I think we would need both of them. So Ian asks, how long could you keep people hibernating that way? I don't know what the limit is. I do know that that basically I'm talking about a medically induced coma, where this sulfur dioxide thing is essentially helping. You're lowering the temperature of the body, and that slows the metabolism way down. Somebody was saying, what about bed sores? I don't know if there'd be bed sores in 0G, but it turns out in my story they were not in 0G. They were at the bottom of a hab that was generating artificial gravity through centrifugal force, and so I had them. I had them in beds that were essentially like rotisseries. Most of the time they'd be upright, but every 3-4 hours this thing would just rotate 90 degrees, and you're really kind of strapped in there. So now you're on your side for a while. Now you're on your face for a while. Anyway, all of these things have to be dealt with, but nevertheless they could be dealt with, and so that was it. Anyway, great question, long answer. Hope that did it for you. Let's see what we got here.